The coffee was the color of murky river water and tasted only slightly better. Clara knew this because she'd had 3 cups already, each one a desperate attempt to wash away the bone-deep weariness that had settled into her marrow years ago. She stood behind the counter of the corner booth, a diner that clung to the edge of town like a barnacle to a forgotten pier. The air was thick with the ghosts of yesterday's fried onions and the low, mournful hum of a neon sign with a flickering T. Her apron, once a crisp white, now bore a constellation of faint stains, each a tiny monument to a spill, a splatter, a hurried meal. A man in a cheap suit, his face pinched with the self-importance of a middle manager, rapped his spoon against his mug, the sharp clink slicing through the quiet diner. "Excuse me," he called, his voice loud enough to make the only other patron, an old man reading a newspaper, look up. "This is cold." Again. Clara turned, her expression placid, a carefully constructed mask she wore to get through the day. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll get you a fresh pot." "You should have gotten it right the first time," he sniffed, pushing the mug toward her with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "It's not that complicated, is it? Hot water, coffee grounds. Even you should be able to manage that." The insult, small and casual, was meant to sting. And it did, but Clara had built up a tolerance to such poisons. She simply nodded, her eyes downcast, and took the offending mug. She moved with an economy of motion born from a decade of weaving between tables, her steps quiet on the cracked linoleum floor. In the kitchen, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, she allowed her shoulders to slump for a single, private moment. She wasn't just tired. She was eroded. Life had been a relentless tide, pulling away pieces of her until she felt like little more than a silhouette of the woman she used to be. The laughter, the dreams, the easy confidence, all washed away, leaving behind this quiet, resilient core. She poured the fresh coffee, the steam warming her chapped hands, and carried it back out. "Here you are, sir," she said, her voice a soft monotone. "Piping hot." He took a loud, performative sip. "Better," he conceded, as if bestowing a great favor. He didn't thank her. He didn't even look at her. To him, she was part of the faded decor, as inanimate as the cracked red vinyl of the booth he sat in. Sal, the owner, watched from his stool by the register, his face a mask of greasy indifference. He wouldn't intervene. Clara was on her own, a tiny, forgotten island in a sea of public disregard. She retreated to her station behind the counter, wiping down a surface that was already clean, her movements automatic. She felt the familiar ache in her lower back, a constant companion. The bell above the door chimed, a discordant jangle that announced new arrivals. Clara straightened her spine, smoothed her apron, and pasted the neutral smile back on her face. The day was far from over. The tide was still coming in, and she had to be ready to stand her ground, however small and insignificant that ground might be. She was just a waitress, a ghost in a dying diner, and that was all anyone ever saw. The silence of her dignity was mistaken for weakness, her endurance for emptiness. The bell chimed again, this time with a violent, percussive force that made the glass in the doorframe shudder. 3 men swaggered in, bringing with them the scent of cheap cologne and stale cigarette smoke. The one in the lead, a man with slicked-back hair and a cruel twist to his lips, was Leo. He was a local parasite, feeding on the fear of people who had little else to give. His 2 companions were pale imitations, shadows that mimicked his predatory slouch. They slid into the booth recently vacated by the man with the cold coffee, their movements loud and proprietary. Leo kicked a chair out from a neighboring table, propping his worn-out boots on it. "Clara, baby," he called, snapping his fingers. "Get us some coffee. And don't bring us that sludge you serve the suits." Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Sal, from his perch by the register, suddenly found the day's receipts intensely interesting, his head buried in the paperwork. The old man with the newspaper folded it with deliberate care, placed a few coins on his table, and shuffled out without making eye contact. Now she was truly alone with them. She picked up 3 clean mugs, her hands steady despite the tremor she felt in her core. This was a different kind of humiliation. The businessman's contempt was dismissive. Leo's was invasive. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to feel small and afraid. "Coming right up, Leo," she said, her voice even. She filled the mugs and carried them over on a tray. As she set them down, Leo's hand shot out, not to take a mug, but to grab her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, his skin clammy. "You know, you're still pretty for an old bird," he sneered, his friend snickering. "A little worn out around the edges, but the engine might still turn over." Clara didn't pull away. She stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on a point just over his shoulder, a water stain on the wall that looked vaguely like a map of a country she'd never visit. To struggle was to give him the satisfaction he craved. She simply waited. Her stillness unnerved him more than any protest could. After a moment, he released her with a shove. "Get us some pie," he ordered, his bravado returning. "And don't be stingy with the whipped cream." She returned with 3 slices of apple pie, the last of the batch she'd baked that morning. They ate like animals, shoveling it in, laughing with their mouths full. They spilled coffee, ground crumbs into the vinyl seats, and smeared whipped cream on the table. It was a deliberate performance of disrespect. When they were finished, Leo stood up, stretching theatrically. He threw a single crumpled dollar bill onto the table, a final insult for a bill that was well over 20. "For your trouble, sweetheart," he said with a wink. They sauntered out, their laughter echoing in the now-silent diner. Clara stood by the table, looking at the wreckage. The sticky smears, the dirty mugs, the pathetic, crumpled dollar. Each stain was a mark of her debasement. Sal finally looked up from his paperwork, his expression unreadable. "Clean it up, Clara," he grunted, before turning his attention back to his numbers. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He was a coward, and they both knew it. Clara picked up a damp rag from its bucket. As she began to wipe away the mess, the sticky residue of their contempt, she didn't feel anger. She didn't feel fear. She felt a profound, hollowing sadness. This was her life, cleaning up the messes left by cruel, careless men, while the world looked on in silence. As Clara's rag moved in slow, methodical circles, wiping away the sticky residue of whipped cream and arrogance, her mind drifted away from the grimy diner. The scent of stale coffee and grease faded, replaced by the faint, comforting aroma of wood smoke and clean linen that had always clung to her husband's clothes. Daniel. His name was a secret ache in her chest, a memory she kept polished and sacred in the dusty attic of her heart. He had been a firefighter, a man built of quiet courage and sturdy conviction. He wasn't loud or boastful. His strength was in his hands, in the steady, reassuring gaze of his brown eyes, in the way he stood when others ran. She remembered one night years ago, when a fire had broken out in the old textile mill on the edge of town. She had waited for him on the porch swing, watching the angry orange glow paint the underside of the clouds. When he finally came home, long after dawn, he was covered in soot, his face etched with exhaustion. He smelled of ash and effort. She had held him, her face pressed against his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart. He hadn't talked about the flames or the danger. He had simply said, his voice rough with smoke, "You don't run from the fire, Clara. You run toward it. That's where people need you." That had been his creed, the principle that guided his every action. It wasn't about being fearless. He'd told her he was scared every single time the bell rang. It was about seeing a need, a person in peril, and choosing to move toward them instead of away. He had run toward his last fire 5 years ago, a chemical blaze at the plastics factory. He had gone back in for a rookie who had gotten trapped, and the roof had collapsed. They had given her a folded flag and a medal for his valor. She would have preferred to have him, smelling of smoke, sitting at their kitchen table. Now, wiping down the sticky vinyl, she understood his words in a new way. Her fires were smaller, smokeless, but they were fires all the same. The contempt of a businessman, the cruelty of a thug like Leo. They were embers that threatened to burn away what little dignity she had left. Running would be easy. She could quit, leave this town, try to start over somewhere else. But where would she go? And what would she be running from? Her own quiet resolve? The memory of the man who taught her that strength wasn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. She wrung out the rag in the bucket of murky water. The reflection that looked back at her was distorted, a pale, wavering version of herself. She saw the fine lines around her eyes, the slight downward turn of her mouth. She looked tired. She looked defeated. But Daniel had always seen something else. He used to trace the line of her jaw with his thumb and tell her, "You've got a spine of steel, Clarabelle." Stronger than anyone knows, he had seen the resilience beneath the quiet exterior, the unyielding core that refused to snap, no matter how hard life bent it. Cleaning up Leo's mess wasn't just a job. It was a small act of defiance. It was her way of saying, "You can make a mess, but you can't break this place. You can't break me." She scrubbed until the table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, until every trace of their presence was gone. She replaced the salt and pepper shakers, straightened the napkin dispenser. She was restoring order, not just to the table, but to her own small corner of the world. Daniel ran into burning buildings. She faced the daily conflagrations of casual cruelty and public indifference. Her battlefield was different, her armor an old, stained apron. But the principle was the same. You don't run from the fire. You stand your ground. You hold the line. The afternoon bled into a dreary evening. A thin, persistent drizzle began to fall, streaking the diner's large front windows and blurring the lights from the street into long, melancholic strokes of color. The dinner rush, if it could be called that, was a pathetic trickle of weary travelers and lonely regulars who ate in silence and paid with exact change. By 9 o'clock, the place was nearly empty again. Sal was counting the meager earnings in the register, his grunts of dissatisfaction a rhythmic punctuation to the quiet hum of the coolers. Clara was refilling ketchup bottles, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of 1,000 such nights. She was exhausted, ready to go home to her small, empty apartment and the ghost of a life she once had. The bell on the door didn't just jangle this time. It was thrown open with such force that it slammed against the wall, the sound like a gunshot in the silent room. Leo and his crew were back. But the lazy, sneering confidence they'd worn earlier had curdled into something uglier, more volatile. Leo's eyes were bloodshot, and he moved with a restless, menacing energy. They hadn't come for pie. They stalked directly to the counter, ignoring Clara, and cornered Sal. "Evening, Sal," Leo said, his voice low and slick with threat. "We need to talk about your insurance policy." Sal's face went pale, a pasty, doughy color under the harsh lights. "Leo, I already paid you this month." "Yeah, well, inflation?" Leo sneered, leaning over the counter until he was inches from Sal's face. "The cost of keeping this fine establishment safe has gone up. We need 500. Tonight." Sal started to tremble. 500? "I don't have that. You saw the business today. It's nothing." "That sounds like a you problem," one of Leo's thugs chimed in, cracking his knuckles with a series of sickening pops. "Maybe we start breaking things to help you find the money." Clara stood frozen by the ketchup bottles. The only other customer, a trucker hunched over a steak in a back booth, deliberately focused on his plate, cutting his meat into meticulously small pieces. He was making himself invisible. He was choosing not to see. Clara looked at Sal, whose eyes were wide with terror, pleading silently with her, with the trucker, with anyone, to do something. But what could they do? What could she do? She was a waitress with $26 in her pocket and a spine that felt like it was turning to glass. The pressure in the room was immense, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. The air was thick with Sal's fear and Leo's predatory glee. Leo reached across the counter and grabbed a stack of clean plates. "Let's start with these," he said, a malicious grin spreading across his face. $100 a plate. You break, you buy, right? He held one up, ready to smash it on the floor. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic, shallow breaths Sal was taking. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of Daniel. You run toward the fire. But this wasn't a fire she could put out. This was a force of nature, a storm of casual violence she had no defense against. Her courage felt like a tiny, flickering candle in a hurricane. Staying silent was the safe thing to do. Staying silent was the sane thing to do. Leo's gaze flickered over to her, a look of pure contempt in his eyes. He saw her, frozen and useless, and it fueled his power. He was about to smash the plate, to shatter the last vestiges of order in this small, forgotten place, when the front door crashed open again. This time it wasn't a bully. It was something broken. A man, huge and imposing even when staggering, stumbled through the doorway. He was bleeding. A dark, ugly stain was spreading rapidly across the side of his heavy leather jacket, and his face was a mask of pain, pale and slick with a mixture of rain and sweat. He took 2 unsteady steps into the diner and collapsed against a table, sending salt shakers and silverware clattering to the floor. For a moment, everyone froze. The tension that had been focused on Sal was instantly diverted to this new, dramatic arrival. Leo and his crew looked at the fallen man, and a slow, ugly smile spread across Leo's face. The man on the floor was wounded, vulnerable, an easy target, a perfect way to demonstrate his power. Well, Leo said, dropping the plate back onto the stack with a clatter. Look what the cat dragged in. He and his thugs started to move toward the bleeding man, their intentions radiating a palpable menace. They saw weakness, a victim. But Clara saw something else. She saw a person in peril. She saw a fire. In that split second, the years of quiet endurance, the memory of Daniel's words, and the core of steel she didn't know she still possessed all fused together. The fear was still there, a cold, sharp thing in her gut, but something else rose to meet it. A fierce, unthinking resolve. Before Leo could take another step, she moved. She darted from behind the counter, her small frame a sudden, unexpected obstacle between the predators and their prey. Get away from him, she said, her voice low and trembling, but with an edge of command that surprised even herself. Leo stopped, blinking in disbelief. What did you say? He laughed. Move it, sweetheart. This ain't your business. He's hurt, Clara stated, kneeling beside the man, ignoring the blood that was beginning to pool on the floor. He needs help. She looked up at Leo, her eyes, usually downcast and weary, now blazing with a protective fire. I said, get away from him. The wounded man groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He was large, with a weathered face, a thick beard, and a tattoo of a raven in flight on his neck. He tried to push himself up, but winced in pain. Clara gently pushed him back down. Stay still, she whispered, her voice softening. She tore a strip from the bottom of her apron, the clean, starched fabric a stark white against the dark blood. She pressed it firmly against the wound in his side, a makeshift compress. She could feel the hot, wet stickiness seeping through, but she didn't flinch. Her hands, which had trembled while filling ketchup bottles, were now remarkably steady. Leo and his cronies watched, momentarily stunned by her audacity. The trucker in the back booth had stopped eating, his fork hovering midair, his eyes wide. Sal was a statue of fear behind the counter. You got a death wish, lady? One of Leo's thugs growled, taking a step forward. Clara didn't look up. Her focus was entirely on the man bleeding on the floor. The back room, she said to him, her voice urgent. We need to get you to the back room. Can you stand? He grunted, nodding weakly. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, Clara hooked her shoulder under his arm, taking on a significant portion of his massive weight. The man, using her as a crutch, slowly, painfully, got to his feet. He towered over her, a wounded giant leaning on a tiny, unshakable pillar. They began the slow, agonizing shuffle toward the kitchen. Every step was a monumental effort. I don't think so, Leo snarled, his shock turning to rage. He couldn't let this happen. A nobody waitress defying him in his own territory. He moved to block their path. Clara didn't stop. She didn't even look at him. She just kept moving forward, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the swinging door to the kitchen. It was an act of pure, unadulterated will. She was a force moving in one direction, and she would not be stopped. Seeing her determination, the raw, undeniable courage in her face, Leo hesitated for a fatal second. In that moment of hesitation, she and the wounded man were through the doors, which swung shut behind them, leaving Leo standing impotently in the middle of the diner. He had been face down, not by a bigger man, not by a weapon, but by a quiet waitress who had decided she'd had enough of running from the fire. Inside the storeroom, surrounded by sacks of flour and cans of peaches, the air was cool and smelled of dust and cardboard. Clara lowered the heavy man onto a stack of potato sacks, her muscles screaming in protest. The adrenaline that had fueled her was starting to fade, leaving a profound, shaking exhaustion in its wake. The man's breathing was shallow, his face pale. The makeshift bandage was already soaked through. "We need to call an ambulance," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "No," he rasped, his voice a low rumble. "No cops. No hospitals." He reached into his leather jacket, his movements slow and pained, and pulled out an old flip phone. He punched a single button with a bloody thumb and held it to his ear. "Sledge," he grunted into the phone. "Ambush. I'm at a diner." "The corner booth," he coughed, a raw, wet sound that made Clara flinch. "Hurry." The phone slipped from his grasp and clattered to the concrete floor. His eyes closed. Outside, in the main dining area, Leo was seething. His authority had been challenged, his humiliation public. He kicked a chair, sending it skittering across the floor. "Stupid broad," he spat. But before he could decide his next move, a new sound began to filter in from the outside. It started as a low, almost imperceptible vibration. A tremor felt more in the bones than in the ears. It grew steadily, a deep, guttural hum that seemed to be coming from the very earth itself. The windows of the diner began to rattle gently in their frames. The sound wasn't one engine. It was dozens, a symphony of raw, untamed horsepower rolling down the highway, getting closer with every passing second. The trucker, who had been frozen in his booth, threw a wad of cash on his table and practically ran for the back exit. He knew that sound. It was the sound of impending judgment. Leo and his crew heard it too. The arrogant sneers on their faces melted away, replaced by a dawning, sickening realization. The blood drained from Leo's face. He knew who used that many bikes. He knew what that sound meant. It was a promise of violence, a gathering storm of leather and chrome. His local brand of thuggery was pathetic, a child's game compared to the force that was about to descend upon this diner. His instinct for self-preservation, far stronger than his pride, kicked in. "Let's go," he hissed to his companions. "Now." They didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled out the front door and disappeared into the rainy night, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. The sound grew into a deafening roar, an apocalyptic thunder that drowned out every other noise. It wasn't just approaching, it was arriving. The diner was now bathed in the sweeping, piercing beams of countless headlights. The patrons, the few who remained in Sal, looked at Clara, who had just emerged from the kitchen, her apron smeared with blood, her face pale but resolute. They looked at her not as a waitress, but as the unlikely catalyst for the storm that was now breaking right outside their door. The air crackled with a terrifying, electric anticipation. The quiet, forgotten diner on the edge of town had suddenly become the center of the universe. The roar of the engines cut out in near-perfect unison, leaving behind a ringing silence that was somehow more intimidating than the noise it replaced. The parking lot of the corner booth, usually a sparse landscape of a few sedans and a pickup truck, was now a solid wall of Harley-Davidson motorcycles. There were 50, maybe 60 of them, parked in tight, disciplined rows, their chrome gleaming under the sputtering neon sign even in the rain. A sea of leather-clad men dismounted, their movements economical and synchronized, like a pack of wolves preparing for a hunt. They were huge, bearded, and covered in the iconography of the Hells Angels, The death's head patch, the territorial rockers, the small, cryptic flashes that spoke of rank and history. The diner door opened, and the man who entered seemed to suck all the air out of the room with him. He was built like a refrigerator, with a bald head, a thick, graying beard, and fists the size of cinder blocks. The patch on his vest read SGT at arms. This was Sledge. His eyes, small and hard like chips of granite, swept across the room, taking in every detail. The terrified owner behind the counter, the few patrons frozen in their booths, the empty, messy table where Leo's crew had been. His gaze was cold, analytical, and utterly without mercy. He was not here to order coffee. Where is he? Sledge's voice was a low growl, a sound like gravel being churned in a cement mixer. It wasn't a question so much as a demand for immediate compliance. Two other bikers, just as large and imposing, flanked him in the doorway, blocking the only exit. Sal, who had been trying to shrink into the wall behind the register, let out a small, terrified squeak. He pointed a trembling finger toward the kitchen door. Sledge's eyes narrowed, locking onto Clara as she stood between him and the kitchen. He saw the blood on her apron, the exhaustion and defiance in her face. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. He was used to people cowering. He was used to fear. He was not used to a small woman in a stained apron holding his gaze without flinching. "He's in there," Clara said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "He's hurt badly. I did what I could, but he needs a doctor." Sledge stopped a few feet from her, studying her face. He saw no fear, only a deep, protective concern. "Step aside," he commanded, his voice flat. Clara didn't move. "Are you going to help him?" she asked, a sliver of challenge in her tone. "Or are you here to cause more trouble?" A dangerous silence fell over the room. One of the bikers by the door took a half-step forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but Sledge held up a hand, stopping him. He continued to stare at Clara, a flicker of something unreadable in his granite eyes. It might have been surprise, or it might have been a sliver of respect. Before he could answer, the kitchen door swung open. The wounded man, Rook, stood there, leaning heavily against the doorframe. He was pale and swaying on his feet, but he was upright. His eyes found Sledge. "Stand down, Sledge," Rook rasped. His voice was weak, but it carried the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. Every biker in the room visibly relaxed, their postures shifting from aggressive readiness to watchful deference. Sledge immediately moved to his president's side, supporting him. "What happened, boss?" Sledge asked, his voice now laced with concern. "Who did this?" Rook's gaze moved from Sledge to Clara. He looked at her, and the hard lines of pain on his face softened. "There were some local punks," he said, his voice gaining a little strength. "They thought a man on the ground was an easy score." He took a ragged breath. "They were wrong." He then looked around the diner, at the cowed patrons, at the terrified owner. This entire place was full of people. They all just watched. They were going to let them finish me. His eyes came back to rest on Clara, and he held her gaze. "All of them, except her." Rook began to recount the story, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. He described how Leo and his crew had advanced on him, their intentions clear. He described how this lone waitress, a woman half their size, had thrown herself between them without a moment's hesitation. "She faced them down," Rook said, his voice filled with a raw, incredulous awe. "She didn't scream. She didn't run. She looked them right in the eye and told them to back off." As he spoke, something shifted in the room. The biker's attention, which had been a heavy, threatening presence, now focused on Clara with a new intensity. It was no longer menacing. It was a look of profound, calculating respect. They were warriors, men who lived by a code of strength and loyalty, and they were hearing a story of courage that would be told and retold in their clubhouses for years to come. An old man, the one who had been reading the newspaper earlier and had returned for his forgotten glasses, found a courage he didn't know he had. He stood up slowly from his booth. "It's true," he said, his voice quavering but clear. I saw the whole thing. Those boys. They were a menace. They were hurting the owner and we all just sat here. But she wasn't afraid. She protected that man like he was her own. The old man's testimony hung in the air, an undeniable confirmation. The truth was now laid bare for all to see. In a room full of silent bystanders, one person had acted. In a world that rewards looking away, she had chosen to see. The president of the Hells Angels, one of the most feared and powerful men in the criminal underworld, owed his life to the quiet, unyielding courage of a waitress in a rundown diner. The Brotherhood looked at her, and for the first time, they truly saw the spine of steel that Daniel had always known was there. The atmosphere in the diner had transformed completely. The oppressive fear was gone, replaced by a thick, palpable current of respect. Sledge looked from Rook to Clara, then back to Rook. A silent communication passed between them, an understanding forged over years of shared violence and unwavering loyalty. Sledge nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. He turned to two of the bikers who had been standing guard at the door. Go find those punks, he said, his voice dangerously calm. The ones the lady described. Have a conversation with them. Make sure they understand the concept of respect. The two bikers grinned, a chilling display of teeth, and slipped out into the night. Their task would be carried out with brutal efficiency. There would be no police report. Leo and his crew had simply ceased to be a problem. With that matter settled, the bikers' focus shifted to the diner itself. Sledge ran a hand over a wobbly table, his brow furrowed in disapproval. Another biker noticed the flickering fluorescent light overhead and grunted. Without a word, they began to move. It wasn't a destructive force anymore. It was a constructive one. One biker, a surprisingly nimble man despite his size, climbed onto a chair and, with a few deft twists, fixed the buzzing light fixture, plunging the room into a steady, clean light. Another found Sal's pathetic toolbox and began tightening the legs on every wobbly table and chair in the place. They moved with a quiet, practiced purpose, transforming the neglected diner piece by piece. Sal watched, dumbfounded, as these terrifying men began to repair his establishment. Clara stood by the counter, equally stunned, as a line of bikers formed in front of the register. Each one pulled out a thick roll of cash, peeling off several $100 bills and placing them on the counter. It wasn't a payment. It was tribute. The pile of money grew to an obscene height, more than Sal had seen in a year. This is for the damages, Sledge said, placing his own contribution on the top. And for the trouble. Rook, leaning against the counter for support, his wound now crudely but effectively patched up by a biker with medic training, beckoned Clara closer. His face was still pale, but his eyes were clear and full of a deep, earnest gratitude. I don't know your name, he said, his voice low. It's Clara, she whispered. Clara, he repeated, tasting the name. In our world, actions define you. Words are cheap. Tonight, your actions spoke louder than 1,000 of our engines. He reached up to his own vest, the sacred kyut, that was the symbol of his life and identity. With careful fingers, he removed a small, simple patch from an inside pocket. It was a patch she had never seen before, not on any of their vests. It was a single, intricately stitched white feather against a black background. This is a guardian angel patch, he explained, his voice hushed. We have them made, but we've never given one out. It's for an outsider who shows the heart of a member. For someone who protects one of our own, who stands when everyone else falls. He held it out to her. This means you are under our protection. Always. It means that any door with our patch on it is open to you. It means that anyone who offers you harm answers to the entire charter. He placed the patch gently in her palm. The thread was thick and sturdy beneath her fingers. It felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the gravity of what it symbolized. Thank you, Clara, he said, and the simple words held more power than any threat or promise she had ever heard. You saved my life. Clara looked down at the patch, then up at the faces of the bikers watching her. In their hard, weathered eyes, She no longer saw a threat. She saw a reflection of her own quiet strength, recognized and honored in the most unexpected way imaginable. She had found a brotherhood. Weeks turned into a month, and the memory of that rainy, violent night began to feel less like a traumatic event and more like a strange, transformative dream. The corner booth was no more. In its place stood Angel's Corner, a name Sal had chosen in a rare moment of inspiration and gratitude. The diner was unrecognizable. The bikers had returned, not with menace, but with tools and supplies. They had replaced the cracked linoleum with polished hardwood floors. The torn vinyl booths were reupholstered in deep red leather. The flickering neon sign was repaired, and now cast a warm, steady glow onto the street. The kitchen was fitted with new, gleaming stainless steel appliances. Sal, buoyed by the influx of cash and the diner's newfound reputation, had even hired a new cook, allowing Clara to focus solely on the front of the house. But the most significant change was not in the decor. It was in the atmosphere. The diner, once a place of quiet desperation, was now a sanctuary. It had become a known neutral ground, a place under the silent, watchful protection of the Hells Angels. Arguments didn't happen here. Trouble didn't start here. Leo and his crew had vanished from the town's landscape as if they had never existed, their absence a quiet testament to the bikers' promise. Clara moved through the renovated space with a new lightness in her step. She was still quiet, still reserved, but the weary resignation was gone, replaced by a calm, steady confidence. Her smile came more easily now, a genuine warmth that reached her eyes. The regular customers, the ones who had been there that night, treated her with a quiet, profound respect. They held the door for her. They called her by name. They saw her not as an invisible waitress, but as the woman who had stood her ground. The bikers were her most loyal customers. At least a few of them were in the diner at all hours, sipping coffee, eating pie, their massive frames somehow fitting into the newly upholstered booths. They never spoke of that night. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. They spoke to Clara with a gruff affection, calling her Clarabelle, a nickname that made her heart ache with the memory of Daniel, but in a sweet, healing way. They were a constant, rumbling reminder that she was no longer alone. They were her family, a strange and unlikely tribe bound not by blood, but by a shared moment of courage. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, as the sun streamed through the sparkling clean windows, Clara sat in a booth by herself, a rare moment of peace. She was sewing. With careful, precise stitches, she was attaching the white feather patch to the chest of her new, crisp apron. It was the only adornment she wore, a stark, beautiful symbol against the plain fabric. As her needle moved in and out, she thought about Daniel. She thought about his creed, about running toward the fire. She had spent 5 years feeling like his legacy of bravery had died with him. But now she realized it hadn't. It had been dormant inside her, waiting for the right flame to awaken it. A low rumble started outside, growing into the familiar, comforting thunder of a single Harley-Davidson pulling into the parking lot. It was Rook making his weekly visit. He was fully recovered now, the only sign of his injury a faint scar he carried with pride. He walked in, nodding to the other bikers, his eyes immediately finding Clara. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that transformed his rugged face. "Sewing, Clarabelle?" he asked, sliding into the booth across from her. She held up the apron, showing him her handiwork. The patch was perfectly centered, a stark symbol of her new reality. "Just making it official," she said softly. He looked at the patch, then at her, his expression full of a deep, abiding respect. "It always was official," he said. "From the moment you stood up." Clara looked out the window, at his gleaming motorcycle parked in the sun. The roar of its engine was no longer a sound of chaos or fear. It was the sound of loyalty. It was the sound of protection. It was the sound of home. For the first time in 5 long years, the quiet, forgotten waitress felt an unmistakable sense of peace. The fires of the world would still burn, but she was no longer afraid. She had her own angels watching over her.